So, I know I just filmed a discussion of one of the books of the Bible yesterday, but here I am again. The book of Ezra is only 10 pages. Now, granted, that's 10 pages of Bible text, right? The small print, the big pages, the small margins, etc. But still, only 10 pages. I finished it off in an afternoon easily. It's a reminder maybe that a lot of these books of the Bible you can just finish off in an afternoon. I tend to make a big deal of it, going through it very slowly, just reading a chapter a night, something like that. But if you have a free afternoon, and I did because the wife and kids were at a birthday party, I could easily just sit down and finish this off in an afternoon. So here I am, the book of Ezra. Actually, if you can see here, the Jerusalem Bible has categorized this as the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and then Nehemiah starts 10 pages later. Now, I initially thought maybe this was some kind of new scholarship type thing because the Jerusalem Bible does try and incorporate modern scholarship into its footnotes, etc. But I looked at Wikipedia, and actually this is not a new thing. This is, for many centuries, the way this book was regarded as one book. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah, sometimes known as Esdras or something like that. If I'm remembering right, it wasn't split into two books until sometime in the 9th century, which surprised me. I mean, who knows? I probably read it once before and forgotten it. But if I had read it before, I forgot it. I didn't realize Ezra and Nehemiah were originally just all one book. Surprising because we switch narrators when we get to Nehemiah. But we'll get more into the narrative perspective in a moment. So Ezra and Nehemiah are both books about the return from exile. And if you're anything like me, these are books that you've read in the past. I studied them in the past at my Christian schools and in Sunday school, but I can never remember them. I mean, you know, I knew that the book of Ezra was about rebuilding the temple after the exile, etc. But if you were to ask me, like, what are the stories in the book of Ezra? What happens? You don't really remember them, right? Or is this just me? It's not like the story in Joshua and Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel, where you can vividly remember all these stories about Samson and the parting of the Red Sea and David and Goliath, right? That are burned into your memory and are a part of your culture. Whereas Ezra, what does happen in Ezra? It's just so easy to forget. Perhaps one of the reasons it's easy to forget is that when it comes to Ezra and Nehemiah, we are truly now in the historic era. So these books, I think, are written roughly contemporary with the events that they describe. There's some debate among historians about how true they are. As you know, there's always debate among historians. But they could be completely true. And at least one atheist scholar that I know of, Robin Lane Fox, who wrote the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction in the Bible, thinks that the book of Ezra contains some authentic documents in it. So, for example, the book of Ezra contains copies of letters sent back and forth between the Persian king, or Persian emperor, I guess, and his governors. And then also there's an edict of Artaxerxes and the king or emperor of Persia. And this purports to be a copy of the document. And Robin Lane Fox, if I'm remembering right, and granted it was several years ago that I read his book, but he believes that this could actually be a copy of a primary document, a legitimate source, a real letter from the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now, again, as with everything, there's debate on this. You go to Wikipedia and there's debate over whether or not these letters are authentic or if they're later forged or stuff like that, but could be authentic. And then Robin Lane Fox also believes that the memoirs of the real Ezra, the historical Ezra, are incorporated into the book of Ezra, although he says the later editors made a mess of it. And if memory serves, he doesn't really elaborate on how or why he thinks that the later editors made a mess of it. But just reading through this, you do notice some jarring changes in the narrator's perspective, which I'm assuming is what he refers to here. So everything is in the third person until we get here to the journey of Ezra, right before chapter 8. And then it changes to I. So this reads like it's either it's the memoirs of Ezra, the real historical figure and the real historical memoirs, or somebody wants you to think that they are. But then, rather abruptly, we change back into the third person. So chapter 9, the leaders approached me to say, at this news, I tore my garments. But then, well, Ezra, son of Elam, and spoke up and said to Ezra. And so now we've changed back to the third person singular. Sorry, the third person narrator. So I assume this is perhaps what Robin Lane Fox means when he says that the editors made a mess of it. Anyways, the point is, all of this can well be historical. And perhaps because it's historical, it's so completely forgettable because there are no myths here. There's no miracles, there's no giants, there's no axe heads floating up to the surface of the river, or any of the chariots of fire, or any of the really memorable parts of the Bible. It just reads like a very dry list of things that happen. Actually, sorry, I take that back. I said very dry, but some of this is actually really quite interesting once you get into it, if you're a history geek. But, okay, let me back up here. So the book of, I'm only going to talk about Ezra today. I'm going to save Nehemiah for another time, even though it's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, but too much of my own upbringing is ingrained in me, so I always consider Ezra a separate book. Anyways, the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah, as I found by consulting the internet, is divided into three parts. So first, the rebuilding of the temple. Second, the rebuilding of the community of Israel. And third, the rebuilding of the walls. And apparently, the chronology of all this is a little bit confused. Scholars are still debating what the exact chronology is, because the editors of Ezra and Nehemiah have sorted this out by theme, not strict chronology. But I don't fully understand the debate on the chronology of this, so I won't get into it. Anyways, the rebuilding of the walls is in Nehemiah, so we'll talk about that when we get to Nehemiah. Today we're just reading Ezra. So the rebuilding of the temple, and then the rebuilding of the community. So the exiles return, and they appear to be under the leadership of a guy called Zerubbabel over here. And Zerubbabel is one of my favorite characters from the Bible, if for no other reason than I just love saying that name. Zerubbabel. That's how my teachers used to pronounce it when we were in Sunday school, and we always used to have fun with that. We meaning the students. Zerubbabel's name, I guess, means seed of Babylon, because he was born into Babylon. Wikipedia says that this is an indication of how quickly the Jewish nobility integrated themselves into Babylonian culture. He's one of the Davidic descendants, apparently, so he's in the line of David. What's interesting about Zerubbabel is he appears in a number of these books. I think he's in Ezra, obviously. I think he pops up in Nehemiah, and he pops up in some of the prophetic books, Zechariah, and I think Haggai as well. I didn't double check that. But nobody really knows what happens to him. He just kind of seems to disappear after a lot of build-up. Christine Hayes, in her lectures on the Old Testament, says that one popular theory is that perhaps there was too much messianic expectations surrounding Zerubbabel, and that the Persians just quietly got rid of him, maybe. But what's interesting, and this is something I didn't realize until I was rereading this afternoon, is that at the very first chapters, the prince of Judah who's leading this expedition is not Zerubbabel, but Shabazar. So, okay, go and search Google, who's Shabazar? Well, nobody really knows. Shabazar comes up as a name of one of the leaders a couple times in the beginning of Ezra. So here he is here, and then he pops up couple more times. Shabazar down here. And then he just completely disappears. So one theory is that Shabazar was just an alternate name for Zerubbabel. Or he was just another person completely. And like Zerubbabel, he just seems to have disappeared for unknown reasons. Just disappeared a little bit before Zerubbabel did. Anyways, the background to all of this is that the Jews were taken into exile at the end of 2 Kings and also at the end of 2 Chronicles by the Babylonians. The Babylonians, however, were in turn conquered by the Persians. And the Persians had a completely different policy of empire than the Babylonians did. The Persian policy of empire was they wanted the people that they conquered to keep their local traditions and keep their local gods. And I believe that the assumption was, if the local people were keeping their gods happy, this would keep the Persian Empire happy. It's the idea that these local gods would then support the Persian Empire. Some of this is me filling in some of the blanks left in this text, but I think that's what's going on here. So Cyrus, as king of Persia, is having the Jews go back to their homeland and rebuild their temple as state policy. That this has all the legitimacy of the edicts of the king of Persia. This is what this is what the Jews want to do, but this is also what the king of Persia wants done. There's a list of returning exiles, which is very boring to read through, but at this point, genealogies are no stranger to our read-through of the Bible. So, just do your best to get through this. And then they go and they lay the foundations for the temple here. And there's an interesting little passage here where they lay their foundations, and the people shouted aloud praises to God. But then it says, "True, many priests and Levites, many heads of families who were then old and had seen with their own eyes the earlier temple on its foundation, wept aloud. But many others raised their voices in shouts of joy, and nobody could distinguish the shouts of joy from the sound of the people weeping. for the people shouted so loudly that the noise could be heard far away. So that's an interesting little historical detail, that even as they're rebuilding the temple, the older people are weeping. I've seen a couple different interpretations of this. I was watching a video right before I filmed this that interpreted this as they were weeping for joy, at the joy of seeing the foundation being laid again, that they never thought they would see. But certainly my first read through of this, my impression was that they were weeping with sorrow because they were remembering the destruction of the old temple, and that they knew that the new temple could never achieve the glory of the old temple, which is why they were weeping. But then we get into the major plot complication here, where the Samaritans, the people who are living in this land, want to help them rebuild the temple. We would like to build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have sacrificed to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. And Zerubbabel and Yeshua, Yeshua I believe is the high priest, they said, "It is not right that you should join us in building a temple for our God. We alone may build for Yahweh, the God of Israel, as we are ordered by Cyrus, king of Persia." And by doing that, they create enemies of the Samaritans. And it seems like kind of a strange hill to die on. I saw one commentary on this. This is by a YouTube channel, the Bible Project. And they were pointing out that as with the stuff that Zerubbabel does here and what Ezra is going to do later, it doesn't appear to be commanded directly by God. It's just their interpretation of what God's will is. Of course, nothing in here is commanded directly by God. Like I said earlier, there are no miracles in this book, and there's nobody talking directly with God. Again, we are past the age of myth here, and we are into the age of real history with these books. Leaving aside, I guess, whether Zerubbabel was right or not to deny the Samaritans the ability to work on the temple, Samaritans want to get their revenge by stopping the work on the temple. So they and the governors of the region send letters back to the king of Persia, asking him to look in the archives and see how rebellious this town of Jerusalem has been in the past. And I guess this lines up with what we know of the history of the kingdom of Judah from 2 Kings, how they revolted against Babylon several times before Jerusalem was destroyed. So the king of Persia, sure enough, looks it up in his archives, and he realizes that, this little town has some history. And then he suspends the rebuilding of the temple. But later, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah get the people all riled up again, and they start rebuilding the temple. The governors tried to stop them, but the Jews don't stop. And just explain, the Jews just claim that, yep, we're rebuilding this because we are on the orders of King Cyrus. Now, King Cyrus is dead by this point. It's his descendants who are reigning in Persia. So the governors send a letter to the king of Persia saying, okay, the Jews are rebuilding the temple. We don't think they're supposed to do it, but they claim to have the Edict of Cyrus. Could you double check that? I guess King Darius does a search and says, yep, sure enough, it checks out. There is an edict from Cyrus saying that they can do this, so go ahead and let them do it. And then they finish building the temple. And it's kind of, like I said at the beginning of this video, when people have a hard time remembering actually what happens in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's because these stories don't really have a satisfying payoff. And I saw a good video on this right after I finished reading it. I watched a couple of videos on YouTube just to kind of inform my review. There was one by the Bible Project, which I will link to in my description down below, which I'm fairly sure is a Christian organization. But they go through the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they say, there are 3 episodes: rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding the Jewish community, and rebuilding the wall. And each of these episodes has some sort of conflict that's set up, and then some sort of strange anticlimax that deals with that conflict, where you're not really sure what the purpose of the story is, or why it has this resolution, or what. But that's the first part, the rebuilding of the temple. And then Ezra, who is rebuilding the Jewish community. Now, Ezra, it looks like, gets sent out a little bit later. He gets sent out by King Artaxerxes, who I think King Artaxerxes... I think this is one of the points of confusion, because there are a couple King Artaxerxes, which is one of the things scholars debate over. I think maybe Artaxerxes was before Darius, and so maybe we might be jumping back in time. Like I said, these 3 episodes are arranged thematically instead of chronologically. But Ezra is a priest and a scribe and very well learned in the law. And so again, because the Jewish religious policy is coinciding with the Persian imperial policy of kind of keeping all the local gods happy, Ezra is sent out by King Artaxerxes to inform the people of the law, teach them about the law if they don't know about it, make sure everyone's following the law. So he gets sent out from, where is he? Persia, Babylon. He gets sent out from the exile community back to the community that's already established itself in Palestine. And that's an important detail, because when he gets to this community that's already established, he's not going to like what they're doing. Now, there's an interesting little thing here telling him about his journey. So he's going here on the road with all this gold that the king has loaded him up for the purposes of dedicating to the temple and fulfilling his mission. And he mentioned he's kind of afraid to travel without an escort. At the same time, he says, "I should have been ashamed to ask the king for an armed guard and cavalry to protect us from the enemy on the road. For we had already told the king, the hand of our God is held out in blessing over all who seek him, his power and his anger over all who turn away from him." So that's an interesting little detail, isn't it? And that's one of those things which makes me think that maybe this is historical. I mean, not that my opinion means anything, because I'm not a scholar or anything like that. But, in the other Old Testament narratives, you don't get that kind of honesty, right? You don't get a character saying, "I was really nervous about making this journey without an armed guard, but I was ashamed to ask the king for one because I had already been bragging about our God." So they pray to God for safety. And sure enough, they arrive at their destination safely. And I guess if you wanted to count that as a minor miracle, maybe fair enough. I said earlier that there weren't any miracles in this book, but there are some fortuitous turns of events that may be attributed to divine intervention if you're so inclined. Certainly that's Ezra's perspective. The reason they arrive safe is because of God's protection. But then we get to the really thorny part here, the marriage with foreigners dissolved. So Ezra arrives and he finds out that the people have been intermarrying with the locals: Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. The video I mentioned earlier, the one by the Bible Project, which, as I said before, I'm fairly sure is a Christian organization, a Christian YouTube channel, they think that part of what's going on here is that the Jews who had been exiled in Babylon, exiled by Babylon, are coming back and they're intermarrying with the Jews that were not sent away in exile. Because I think what happened is only the nobility got exiled. The common people stayed behind. And so they think Ezra is maybe confusing the Jews who stayed in Palestine with the Gentile people. I don't know where they're getting that information. It certainly doesn't seem to be here in the text, but, you know, there's a lot of things I don't know. They also think the same thing about the Samaritans who want to help rebuild the temple. They think that possibly these are just Jews who didn't get exiled. But anyway, Ezra is not happy when he finds out about the intermarrying. He throws a little bit of a fit at this news. I tore my garments and my cloak. I tore hair from my head and the beard and sat down quite overcome. And he calls everyone together and he says, look, you guys cannot intermarry with the foreigners. This is the reason we all got exiled in the first place. You need to dissolve these marriages. There's a little bit of resistance to it. Very little, apparently. Only Jonathan, son of Ashiel, and Heziah, son of Tikva, supported by Meshullam and Sabbatai the Levite, were opposed to this procedure. Everyone else seemed to agree to it, although they have a little bit of qualms about the procedures. They said, yes, but come on, it's the rainy season. This is going to take time to dissolve these marriages, so we need to do it locally. But they do go ahead and dissolve these marriages, seemingly willingly. Now, when we get to the end of Nehemiah, and we'll maybe talk about that when we talk about the book of Nehemiah, things get a little bit more violent. So Nehemiah finds some people who are still married to foreigners, and he assaults them. He pulls their hair and stuff like that. So that is leveling things up a notch. But here in the book of Ezra, it appears that everyone just willingly dissolves their marriages, and we get a list of everyone who dissolves their marriages. But this thing going on in Ezra and Nehemiah, where, these laws do come from the book of Deuteronomy, where you're not supposed to intermarry with the foreigners. But this is, I think, the first time we hear a really big deal of a purge going on, like, get these women out of our community, they are not pure blood. Which is, in light of the 20th century and some of the history we've gone through there with the emphasis on getting rid of people who don't have the right blood, I think you can't help but read these passages with some foreboding, some feelings of unease. Now, I am almost out of time here because my camera will only let me do 30-minute video files before it stops recording. And there is a lot to say about this subject. I already mentioned this before when I talked about the book of Ruth. One theory is that the book of Ruth was actually written around this time and was written in response to the racial purity being advocated in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ruth is a Moabite. And Moabites are one of the women mentioned here in Ezra, and again will be one of the women mentioned in Nehemiah when Nehemiah is breaking up the mixed marriages. There is also, if you go to Wikipedia, there's no shortage of debate about, is this racial, is it spiritual, is this kind of for all time, is this a special place in history, what are the reasons for doing it? And there is a long discussion we could have here, which I actually can't have because I'm out of time here on my video file limit. But yeah, the racial purity aspect of Ezra and Nehemiah. Talk about Nehemiah another day. But it's an odd note to end on. The Bible Project, which I talked about before, also thinks this is a bit odd. They think Ezra is acting somewhat on his own initiative. They contrast this with the prohibition against divorce in Malachi, and I'm out of time. Okay.